The United States president is often referred to as the most powerful man in the world.
The name Trump echoed through the media, gilded in controversy and the unmistakable scent of authority. Yet few had access to Marielle's voice in the secluded halls of scholarship and the hushed ambience of private family events. At 60, Trump was no longer a passive onlooker. That trained psychologist and niece of the former commander-in-chief had moved beyond silent observation. She now offered cutting insight, delivered in composed and deliberate language. She exposed the fractures beneath the glossy exterior, not gossip, but a methodical examination. This was a professional autopsy of a crumbling dynasty. So what unfolds when a mental health expert turns her lens toward her own uncle, one who once held the globe's highest office? The shift came in May 2025, as Mary Trump addressed the Hay Festival in Wales. A psychologist, author, and Donald Trump's niece, she took the platform with calm, authority, and penetrating focus. She had long watched from the edges of the family spotlight. Now, at 60, she came forward not merely as kin, but as a clinician with a front-row seat to history. Her statement sent shockwaves. "My uncle wants to rule for life." That was no exaggeration. To her, it was a professional conclusion drawn from decades of intimate knowledge. She painted Donald Trump as a man propelled by raw impulse and relentless drive, someone emotionally frozen in youth, whose character had remained unchanged for decades. Until now, Mary had steered clear of public denial.
President Trump's niece, Mary Trump, since the publication of her explosive new memoir, Too Much and Never Enough.
In her 2020 bestseller, Too Much and Never Enough, Mary Trump peeled back the layers of familial dysfunctionally to find her own work similarly dissected. Yet this time, her warnings carried renewed force. She described a man who, as she phrased it, holds himself in excessively high regard, wielding charm as both shield and sword. It was, in her view, a fixation on superficial traits. She commented on his obsession with appearances and empty praise, noting, "You don't need to know someone well to compliment their looks." Mary's critique moved past anecdote into behavioral analysis. She explained how Donald Trump's preoccupation with external image, particularly among men, is a tool of influence. "He's quite charming," she conceded, adding that his drive to be liked isn't casual, it's fundamental to his manipulation strategy. Approval for him is not about connection but control. She emphasized that speaking out stemmed from duty. The public, she insisted, deserved to understand who Donald Trump truly is. Silence, in her eyes, was no longer an option out when the consequences were so immense. Her assessment painted him as deeply problematic, a man of impulse, ambition, and boundless willingness to cross any line to succeed. Her words left the audience gripped by unease. As Mary concluded, one haunting question lingered. If the individual holding the nation's highest office is, as she argues, emotionally immature and dangerously ambitious, what does that signal for America's future? And more haunting still, what early wounds shaped the boy who would someday rise to the presidency?
The family that built a president.
But what pain forged the man destined to command a nation? According to Mary Trump, the sole family insider holding a doctorate in clinical psychology and covering the truth, requires more than tracing years. One must dig through generations, into the cold and voiceless chambers of the Trump household. This wasn't a home built for nurturing leaders. More accurately, it was engineered to create predators. Mary's reappearance at the age of 60 is far from symbolic. Her warning is not a recycled narrative, it's a professional, clinical assessment of a man, a legacy, and a country teetering on the edge. She is not spreading hearsay. She is documenting a profound emotional collapse. Her central thesis, a young boy frozen in emotional adolescence. Donald Trump, America's 47th president, remains, in her words, developmentally stunted, not a vague metaphor but a pattern deeply rooted in decades of toxic family structure, joyless upbringing, and a ruthless patriarchal system that honored power and punishment over kindness. Compassion was weakness. Empathy invited ridicule. At the core stood Fred Trump Sr., the architect of this emotional framework. Mary bluntly labeled her grandfather a sociopath. Not just strict, he viewed affection as irrelevant, governing through cold logic rather than love. The household was ruled like a fortress under constant watch. Feelings were vulnerabilities. Acts of kindness invited shame. Mary's father, Fred Jr., sought a different life. His dream of becoming a pilot reflected a gentle, hopeful spirit to unacceptable traits in the Trump lineage. He showed warmth, he showed emotion, and for that, he was mocked, crushed beneath relentless criticism, until addiction silenced him. Rejected by his father, ignored by his siblings, Fred Jr. died at just 42. While the rest of the family laid blame on him, Mary did not. She recognized that the very foundation they idolized had destroyed him. Donald witnessed it all. Watching his elder brother's destruction, he made a vow he would never be the one ridiculed, never vulnerable. Instead, he absorbed Fred Sr.'s worldview entirely. Charm became his camouflage, compassion became an enemy. What the world sees today, loud, domineering, incapable of reflection, was shaped in that moment, then refined across a lifetime. Mary recalls Donald not as mischievous or rebellious, but but as deliberately cruel, even in early years. She recounts a story from childhood, a simple game of catch. Even as a child, Donald hurled the baseball with punishing force, not to engage, but to dominate. While other kids eventually softened, he never did. To Fred Sr., this aggressive streak wasn't troubling, it was admired. He praised it, fed it. Mary Trump recalls that Donald was groomed not to be cherished, but to be obeyed. He was treated as exceptional, a monarch to be revered on the condition that he remained dominant. Mary believes that fixation remains unchanged. He's still consumed with image, hypersensitive to perceived disrespect, and still thrives on approval from powerful figures. She describes his compliments as transactional tools to command attention, not signals of genuine affection. Praise is a currency for control. Charm is just strategic manipulation. The same ruthless logic extended even after Fred Sr.'s death. When Mary and her brother disputed the will, the toxic dynamics resurfaced. Donald retaliated by cutting off medical coverage for Mary's nephew, a child living with cerebral palsy. Yes, that really happened. A vulnerable child's health care became a pawn in a legal standoff. That, Mary says, is the level of control this family has always wielded. For years, Mary remained silent. She feared no one would take her seriously. That changed in 2020 with her book Too Much and Never Enough. Now, with renewed urgency, she's speaking again, not merely about dysfunction, but issuing a clinical warning. She says Donald Trump, once again aspiring to power, is the same emotionally stunted figure, reactive, praise-hungry, blame-averse. The stakes are no longer personal, they are national. If such a man holds the reins of leadership, Mary urges us to stop asking who failed him and start asking who will suffer next. So how did Donald Trump become the man he is today? The rise of a textbook narcissist. To understand the psychological framework, we return again to Mary Trump, not just a family member, but a clinical expert offering a rare insider analysis. What she reveals is deeply unsettling. Referring to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, Mary argues that her uncle Donald exhibits all 9 diagnostic traits of narcissistic personality disorder. Every single one. This isn't casual vanity. It far exceeds the everyday ego. According to Mary, his self-importance masks something hollow. Beneath the surface lies a fragile sense of self, constantly in search of validation because at his core, he fears he is none of what he pretends to be. But this is no amateur diagnosis. Mary Trump further posits that her uncle may also exhibit traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, an affliction defined by persistent deceit, manipulation, and a disregard for the rights of others. In its extreme forms, it aligns with psychologist Shi Jen adds to the diagnosis, suggesting the possibility of dependent personality disorder and a long-overlooked cognitive impairment, one that may have silently hindered Donald's ability to process information effectively for decades. Taken together, Mary's portrait becomes deeply unsettling. A man whose emotional development stalled so early that, in her clinical judgment, he remains frozen, unable to mature, evolve, or emotionally. He may not have progressed much beyond the age of 3. But how does such a psychological state take root? Mary traces the source back to the emotionally barren landscape of his early years. Fred Trump Sr., Donald's father, is depicted as someone who methodically stripped his son of the capacity to engage with the full spectrum of human emotion. In Fred's worldview, softness equated to weakness. He sought ruthlessness, not empathy. Displays of feeling were scorned. Donald learned quickly, witnessing his elder brother Freddie being crushed under the pressure of this rigid system. He concluded that only by mirroring his father's coldness could he survive. Added to this was the distance of a chronically ill mother, physically present but emotionally absent. This created a void, which Mary describes as a lifelong deprivation, one that laid the groundwork for narcissism, cruelty, and delusions of grandeur. Each boast, every act of defiance, was an offering, an attempt to earn his father's fleeting approval. Over time, this evolved into a desperate hunger, an insatiable search for external validation to fill an internal vacuum. The anecdotes Mary includes are telling, and at times jarring. One story recounts Donald allegedly hiring someone to take his satsa, an early sign, she suggests, of deception becoming normalized. Another describes how he tormented his younger brother Robert by deliberately hiding toys, acts of casual cruelty, seeded early and never corrected. That pattern of dominance and belittlement extended into adulthood, even touching family boundaries. Mary alleges that he once made lewd comments about her appearance while she wore a bathing suit, another moment in a long string of objectifying behavior toward women. Have you ever encountered someone who must be the center of attention, whose interactions all seem constructed to elevate themselves? Mary frames this not as simple vanity, but as a carefully constructed survival mechanism built in a home where affection was conditional and power was prized. In her view, the man the world sees today is not merely flawed but sculpted by a legacy where strength meant cruelty, and love was nothing more than a transaction. But when those carefully concealed family myths, those chains that bind a dynasty, are suddenly dragged into the unforgiving spotlight.
Family secrets exposed.
for the Trump dynasty. Mary Trump's explosive publication Too Much and Never Enough landed less like a traditional book launch and more like a full-scale detonation. The carefully manufactured image of unity and exceptionalism was suddenly under assault from within its own bloodline. The response came swiftly and predictably: legal warfare. Citing a non-disclosure agreement tied to the 2001 settlement of Fred Trump Sr.'s estate. It was Donald Trump's younger brother Robert who first stepped forward, attempting to halt publication and silence Mary. One can only imagine the immense pressure as the weight of the family machine bore down. Despite those efforts, the book sold nearly 1 million copies on release day. The veil had been lifted on what lay beneath was staggering. But the most startling revelation came not from the book's pages, but from the author herself. Mary disclosed that she had served as the anonymous source behind the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning expose of Donald Trump's finances. Yes, you heard that correctly. These weren't rumors, they were documented records, tax filings, and hard evidence. The Times reported what it described as fraudulent financial practices that helped the Trump family, particularly Donald, sidestep hundreds of millions in gift taxes. The investigative series exposed a sophisticated scheme that funneled what amounts to over $424 million in today's currency from Fred Trump Sr.'s real estate empire directly into Donald's ventures. This wasn't just about inherited wealth. It painted a picture of wealth transferred through calculated manipulation and financial trickery. In September 2020, Mary took her confrontation a step further. She filed a lawsuit against Donald, her Aunt Mary Ann, and the estate of her late Uncle Robert, asserting that they had systematically undervalued her stake in the family fortune and coerced her into an unfair settlement decades earlier, her tens of millions of dollars. Her bold claim was simple, that in the Trump household, fraud wasn't an aberration, it was a family tradition. Although Mary eventually dropped the case in November 2022, the battle lines had been firmly drawn, and Donald, never one to shy away from litigation, struck back. In September 2021, he launched a $100 million lawsuit against Mary and the New York Times, accusing them of conspiring to obtain and publish his confidential documents. However, by May 2023, a judge ruled against the newspaper, ordering Trump to pay nearly $400,000 in legal fees. Mary saw the countersuit as nothing more than a desperate retaliation. Then, in a twist, a court in May 2024 allowed the case against Mary to proceed for her alleged breach of the 2001 confidentiality agreement, but also hinted that any awarded damages would likely be symbolic. The family's public response was no less fiery. In a dramatic turn, Mary leaked audio recordings of her Aunt Mary Ann Trump Berry, a retired federal judge. While Donald Trump publicly dismissed his niece as troubled and her book as vindictive, those tapes revealed something far more damning. His own sister, in unguarded moments, labeled Donald a liar, devoid of principle, and consumed by cruelty. It was a damning chorus, not from enemies, but from within the walls of the Trump empire. Would you risk shattering family bonds this deeply to reveal what you believe is the truth? Mary's background makes this more than a familial feud. Her credentials change everything. As a trained clinical psychologist who once lived in the Trump household, she occupies rare territory. While many commentators have hesitated to apply diagnostic labels to Donald Trump, often citing the Goldwater rule, which warns against diagnosing public figures without direct evaluation, Mary did not hesitate. Her proximity, both familial and clinical, gave her a unique lens. She didn't just know what behaviors to analyze, she understood their significance. This isn't your typical revenge memoir. Mary Trump's work presents the Trump legacy not only as a personal unraveling, but as a public case study in pathological power. Long before the world began asking questions, she was already tracing the psychological architecture from behind academic walls. Later came Too Much and Never Enough, the personal, the clinical, and the explosive, all in one.
Mary Trump unloads in a new book the Trump family tried to stop. Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man.
The title alone felt like a verdict to much and never enough, and on release day, it exploded. Nearly 1 million copies sold in just 24 hours. Let that register. One day, 1 million books. This wasn't just a memoir, it was a breach in the wall the Trump family had spent generations fortifying, and the betrayal cut deep. This didn't come from a political opponent or a disillusioned aide. It came from family, from blood. But Mary Trump didn't stop there. What followed could arguably be even more consequential. She raised her voice, publicly and repeatedly. She launched The Mary Trump Show, a podcast where political analysis meets psychological inquiry. It's not just about headlines, it's about the emotional blueprints beneath them. She engages with scholars, journalists, and even just herself in a segment aptly titled The Nerd Avengers, unpacking not just the facts, but the emotional wiring behind them: charisma, deception, fury, control. Mary isn't simply categorizing her uncle's conduct, she is interpreting a psychological file in real. Asked what diagnosis would apply if Donald Trump were her patient, she responded without flinching. Antisocial personality disorder? Narcissistic personality disorder? He's profoundly unwell, she stated, not with malice, but with clinical detachment. What lends her voice extraordinary weight is not just the insight, but the credibility. Mary isn't peddling speculation, she's offering interpretations most wouldn't even think to make. And her core thesis is, in fact, frighteningly accessible. To understand Donald Trump's behavior in politics, you must begin with the household that raised him, a home where approval was conditional, affection was a transaction, and emotional vulnerability was punished. In Mary's framing, the hostility that shocked a nation wasn't an anomaly, it was inherited currency, learned, rewarded, perfected. What leaves the strongest impact isn't only the psychological language, it's the tone, the instinct behind her words. Whether speaking on MSNBC or behind her podcast mic, Mary isn't grandstanding. She's issuing a clinical alarm. When viewed through the lens of pathology, Trump's governing style ceases to resemble strategy. Instead, it begins to look like an emotional crisis. In motion, compulsive dishonesty, vindictive obsession, an unrelenting fear of humiliation, and unlike pundits or columnists, Mary Trump carries three undeniable forms of authority: academic, credentials, lived experience, and emotional proximity. It forces a question: should we trust a psychological evaluation from a family member who has devoted her life to diagnosing such behaviors? If so, what does Mary's analysis suggest about the Trump legacy and the nation's future? Mary's voice no longer resembles a distant alarm. It's now a present chronicle, delivered in the era of Donald Trump's return to the White House. With Republicans controlling both the Senate and the House in early 2025, she argues this second ascent is far more dangerous than his 2016 victory, which she considered reckless but naive. This time, she says, it is purposeful, calculated. From her rare perspective, part clinician, part estranged kin, Mary Trump offers no comforting illusions, no false optimism. In her estimation, the American democratic experiment now walks a narrow, perilous line. Her warnings are not couched in civility, they are urgent, unfiltered. They carry the weight of someone who believes she is witnessing democracy's unraveling. A second Trump presidency, she warned long before a single vote was cast, would revolve around a singular, corrosive objective: retaliation. Not governance, not leadership, but a personal campaign against perceived enemies. In Mary's view, that's not policy, it's vengeance, weaponized. And it could dismantle everything. The same ominous path continues forward. The institutional safeguards that once imposed limits during Donald Trump's first term have either been dismantled or are on the verge of disappearing. Imagine a federal government where agencies like the FBI and Department of Justice systematically replace independent civil servants with loyalists whose dedication lies not with the Constitution, but directly with Trump himself. Mary Trump insists this is not exaggeration. It's a calculated dismantling of the democratic system. With a compliant judiciary, she warns, there would be nothing left to contain him. She sees his motivations narrowed to profiteering and settling personal scores, leading the country into a direction many are simply not prepared to face. He's lethally detached, she stated. Whatever faint moral instincts he once had, she believes, are now gone. But how, she asks, did America arrive at this treacherous point? While her uncle is central to the critique, Mary also places blame on the Democratic Party. In her view, they were woefully unprepared for the magnitude of the threat heading into the 2024 election. She describes them as operating under outdated assumptions, incapable of seeing that their opposition had already burned the old rulebook. They failed, she argues, to understand that the Republican Party had moved far beyond traditional politics soaking their rivals in gasoline and lighting the match. At the same time, Democrats neglected key communities, especially minority voters who felt increasingly disillusioned and ignored, and they were distracted by performative battles, misdirecting energy away from the actual existential crisis at hand. The result was a power vacuum, a fractured party lacking bold, decisive leadership, unable to push back against the tide. Yet, even amid this bleak political terrain, Mary Trump still searches for signs of resistance and tries to inspire it. She sees opportunity in the expected chaos of a Republican Party fractured by its own extremism. That disarray, she believes, could open space for Democratic resurgence. She places her hopes in a coalition of state leaders, figures like Gretchen Whitmer, Josh Shapiro, J.B. Pritzker, and others who, she believes, represent a new generation of moral and strategic leadership. But Mary is also clear, the Democratic Party must do more, much more. It must invest in building an independent progressive media infrastructure that can go toe-to-toe with the well-oiled machinery of right-wing propaganda. She emphasizes the need to fight not just on the surface, but in deeper, sometimes unconventional, ways to protect immigrant rights, defend women's bodily autonomy, and preserve environmental regulations under assault. Mary admits that real progress may require personal sacrifice, but, she insists, the fight is essential. her message remains consistent and sobering. The stakes are existential. Will her warnings come to pass? And what becomes of Mary Trump herself, the figure behind the bestseller lists, psychological assessments, and viral commentary? After decades spent dissecting the Trump family from within, scrutinizing it, exposing it, Mary Trump is now stepping into a new phase. At 60, she is no longer just Donald Trump's niece issuing clinical alarms. She's evolving. Mary has become a podcaster, a media voice, and now, unexpectedly, a fiction author. Yes, a novel, and not the lighthearted romance one might expect. In collaboration with journalist Narma Jean Carroll, the woman who successfully challenged Donald Trump in court, and legal scholar Jennifer Taub, Mary is co-authoring a story steeped in emotional complexity and political critique. The upcoming novel merges themes of betrayal, intimacy, and justice. Think courtroom drama meets feminist resistance. Mary insists this new book is not escapist fluff. It's a pointed, satirical, and emotionally rich tale, a fictional vehicle for truth-telling in a culture struggling with denial. This latest literary pursuit reflects more than reinvention. It signals continuation of resistance, of storytelling, and of bearing witness. This isn't just an escape, it's a reclamation. Mary Trump is no longer analyzing chaos from the sidelines. She's now creating on her own terms. After years of living beneath the weight of men who distorted power into pathology, she's carving out a new reality, her own world, her own voice. It's not just about her novel. Her podcast, The Mary Trump Show, has evolved into something deeper, a virtual gathering space for those searching for stability in a world that feels upside down. Each episode offers the comfort of sitting with a brutally honest friend, someone who won't sugarcoat the truth just to spare your feelings. Her guests include scholars, trauma survivors, thinkers, and activists. And her tone, it's direct, unfiltered, and unexpectedly laced with humor. Given that she regularly unpacks authoritarianism and the psychology of abuse, Mary doesn't shout or plead, she clinically observes, then explains. Yet there's something else happening, something quietly profound. She's beginning to soften, not in truth-telling but in self-expression. As firm as she remains on who her uncle is, she's becoming gentler about who she can become. Her Substack newsletter shifts between searing political critique and deeply personal reflection. One day she's examining the fragility of democracy. The next she's musing over her favorite literary tropes or reflecting on why families like hers dodge difficult conversations. You can feel the creative energy radiating off her. Her latest endeavors are not acts of retaliation, they're statements of independence. She's not chasing attention. She's had the headlines. CNN, MSNBC, bestseller list, she's been there. This new chapter, it's about intimacy over influence. Less spotlight, more authenticity. This isn't retreat, it's refinement, control, precision. At a recent appearance at the Hay Festival in Wales, when asked what comes next, her answer was simple and chilling. I'm going to keep talking, but the subject is shifting, less about diagnosing her infamous uncle, more about her own healing. Which raises a profound question: what happens when the nation's sharpest witness to American corruption no longer sees herself as a diagnostician, but as a creator? When she trades her clinical scalpel for a pen? Perhaps, just perhaps, Mary Trump is reshaping pain into narrative, turning anguish into art. After everything she's endured, revealed, and survived, this may be her most radical act yet. To find love, to write fiction, to imagine futures beyond the trauma. And yes, before you ask, the book is nearly here. And yes, we'll be reading it. But ask yourself honestly, would you ever dare to write a book about your own family? Assuming, of course, you no longer attend holiday dinners. After years of shocking revelations, media firestorms, and psychological autopsies of a fractured family empire, now comes the reckoning. What remains? What did Mary Trump's voice truly shift? Where do we go from here? What she left behind is more than a memoir or a media moment. It's a blueprint, a reckoning. Her voice pierced a carefully guarded legacy, and in doing so, she redefined the role of the family insider, a 60-year-old PhD in clinical psychologist. Mary Trump didn't just publish a bestseller, she gave the world an intimate, terrifying breakdown of how a president was shaped. Her disclosures weren't just shocking, they were consequential. Her first book sold nearly 1 million copies on its first day. Her leaked records became the foundation of the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation into financial misconduct. Some still wonder, was she settling old scores? Or was she, as she has always insisted, trying to protect the country from a danger only she fully recognized? Her diagnosis of Donald Trump, narcissist, sociopath, and in her words, the most dangerous man alive, now resonates with uncanny clarity in 22.5. Now, as she rewrites her story, no longer the whistleblower, but the author, the creator, we left to watch what she does next. And maybe we'll find healing in her plot twist too.
It's really interesting. In terms of his character, he has not changed, which is kind of a dangerous sign. People are supposed to evolve, and he never has.
It's truly compelling when you consider one fact: Donald Trump hasn't changed. That, in itself, is alarming. Most people evolve, mature, adapt. He hasn't. And that, Mary Trump warned, is not only a psychological red flag, but a national concern. In retrospect, many viewed her remarks as uncannily prophetic. As time passed, events began to align with her early claims. A man emotionally suspended in adolescence, driven by ego, and dependent on constant validation from others. Her depiction of his authoritarian leanings, shaped in large part by a lifelong fear of his father's rejection, began to resonate more widely. Even the story of him allegedly paying someone to take his SATs served as a rules for him were not rules. They were flexible, and facts, just another tool to be bent or bought. Today, Mary Trump remains a distinct voice in the post-2024 political landscaper, period. She is described as the worst possible outcome for democracy. Her presence has endured not just as commentary, but as a form of civic vocabulary. For many disillusioned Americans, she offered a way to interpret the emotional chaos surrounding the Trump era. Her framing of trauma within the Trump family, where affection was transactional and cruelty rewarded, moved a discussion beyond partisan politics. It gave emotional clarity to many who had previously lacked the words to describe what they sensed was deeply wrong. The White House, unsurprisingly, denounced her statements as fabrications. Lawsuits and countersuits followed, yet despite these efforts, the core of her psychological critique that Donald Trump lacks the capacity for responsible leadership has deeply influenced public discourse. What lingers is the enduring question: can Mary's evaluation be considered fully clinical, given the absence of a formal therapeutic setting? Or does her rare blend of proximity and professional expertise offer the kind of lived analysis the public desperately needed? Whatever the answer, her contribution has been transformative. Mary Trump catalyzed a broader national conversation, only about her uncle but about the nature of power itself, the fragility of leadership, and the fine, often invisible line separating political theater from private pathology. Her narrative reminds us that behind the spectacle of American politics, there is often a deeply personal human story. And sometimes, the person best equipped to tell it isn't a politician or pundit, but a family member with a PhD and the courage